We're trying to remove those barriers to them being able to adopt new technologies and bring innovation into government faster. And the way that we are really focused on doing that is to enable trust from a security standpoint so that we can empower those participating governments that we're working with to adopt the new technologies, to embrace innovation, and to know their role in that kind of shared responsibility that we all play.
Welcome to another episode of Trust Versus, a podcast powered by HITRUST, a global leader in cybersecurity assurances. My name is Jeremy Huval, Chief Innovation Officer with HITRUST. I'm joined by Ryan Patrick. Ryan
Patrick, Vice President of Market Research and Strategy at HITRUST.
Ryan, who are we talking to and why?
We're talking to some friends of the family, so to speak. Leah McGrath, who is the Executive Director at GovRAMP. They're doing a lot of similar work to what FedRAMP is doing at the federal level around cloud service providers. And we're also joined by Brian Conrad, who currently works at Zscaler, but is the former acting director of the FedRAMP PMO. And what we're talking about is harmonization, recognition, acceptance of like standards by other standards bodies to alleviate the burden of having to report or comply with multiple regulations for organizations. Because when you think about the way it works today, all of the onus and all of the responsibility has been put on the individual organization that has to attest, that has to comply, that has to demonstrate their maturity from a security perspective. All the weight has been put on their shoulders to either absorb the cost of conducting multiple assessments, but also absorb the time and the stress that comes with likely being in a perpetual audit loop because you've got so many things that you need to demonstrate your maturity and or compliance for. So this episode is really about creating a call to action, trying to generate some momentum between standards bodies or even between regulators and other type of organizations to work together and take the burden off of the entity being assessed and put it on the backs of those standards bodies, regulators, what have you, to do the homework up front so they can leverage the work that they've done for one to apply to all.
Yeah, and so to play that back to you, this episode's about the problem of multi-compliance. A company has to comply with a great many cybersecurity rules, regulations, standards, because they deal with different types of data, different jurisdictions, different customer demands. And how do we navigate that problem space? And it's not all just problem admiration. We also talk about an exciting program we have in place between HITRUST and GovRAMP as a great example for what the future can look like to help alleviate some of this burden. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Our guests today bring two critical perspectives to the conversation around cybersecurity frameworks and public trust. Leah McGrath is the Executive Director of GovRAMP, where she works to streamline and strengthen cybersecurity compliance across state and local governments, primarily focused on cloud service providers and cloud-based technologies. Brian Conrad is the Director of Global Strategic Compliance Initiatives at Zscaler and formerly served as the Acting Director at the FedRAMP PMO office. So he knows firsthand how federal standards are built, implemented, and where they sometimes fall short. So I am pretty excited about this conversation. This one is near and dear to my heart, not just from a HITRUST perspective, but as a security practitioner. I feel that there's a lot to be gained based on what we're going to be talking about today. But as always, I'm joined by my partner in crime, Jeremy Huval. And let's start off, Leah. What can you tell me about kind of your world today and the work that GovRAMP is trying to do?
Oh, that's a big question, Ryan. Thank you so much for having us. I mean, you nailed it. When it comes to the public sector, we think about states, local government, education institutions. Sometimes it can be difficult. We're trying to remove those barriers to them being able to adopt new technologies and bring innovation into government faster. And the way that we are really focused on doing that is to enable trust from a security standpoint so that we can empower those participating governments that we're working with to adopt the new technologies, to embrace innovation, and to know their role in that kind of shared responsibility that we all play. What is everyone's role? What's yours? What's mine? Was ours when we are driving new technologies forward? And so that's what we are really trying to do, is to drive the conversation, bring the different stakeholders together, whether it's from the government perspective, industry, experts, partners like you at HITRUST as well, to come together to kind of drive forward that common accountability.
Yeah, and I think it's probably important to point out that we are focused on reducing kind of the fatigue, the stress, the redundancy of having to do multiple audits when you work within a multi-regulatory or multi-reporting environment, as I call it, where you may be an organization that not only has to achieve HITRUST certification, but you want to do business with the state or federal government. You need to get GovRAMP/FedRAMP. You probably have a SOC 2. You may do PCI. These are all right now, today, individual audits. And what comes with individual audits? A perpetual loop of being audited and additional cost, additional money or time spent, and additional stress. So what we're talking about here today is, to a certain degree, framework harmonization, but I think probably more directly put, we're looking for collective acceptance across framework bodies and standards bodies and things like that to reduce the burden that we just mentioned. So, Brian, I want to come to you. What are you seeing the biggest signs of strain or friction in the current landscape from a compliance or security perspective as it relates to audits and framework adoption?
First of all, thank you for having me. And you hit the nail on the head. There's this perpetual loop of audit, and it's not just in government entities at the states, but it's also in industry as well. We have industry partners meet multiple international standards in some cases and domestic standards. And there's a perpetual loop of getting audited. There's an audit for our European requirements and our Asia Pacific requirements, our domestic US requirements, state, local, and Fed. And so all that amounts to resources that a industry partner has to expend to ensure that we're meeting all of the different requirements for compliance and cybersecurity. And that's a drain internally as well as it's a very similar problem as you articulated with the states.
And to date, the way it's worked, because we are in this multi-regulatory, multi-framework environment, whether it's the federal government implementing regulations or laws that organizations have to comply with, both in the public or the private sectors, or there's individual standards like HITRUST and to a certain extent GovRAMP, although it's getting a lot more traction at the state level. The way it works today, the landscape today, is that the onus has been put on the individual organization to solve this problem and bear the weight of working within that multi-regulatory, multi-reporting environment. Is that what you're seeing, Leah? Like pushback from your customers on having to do all this type of work because they've already done it in some other form or fashion?
It's such a great point. We just look at the federal government was one of the first to really take on, and some of these bigger industries in the financial sector as well, to take on the idea of, hey, we need to have some cybersecurity standards that we're measuring, right? And especially in the 1990s and the early 2000s, if we go back and look at some of the different regulations that are out there, whether it's for federal tax information, right? IRS publications, or for healthcare organizations, MMIS, Medicaid Management Information Systems, you name it, FERPA. We could go through all the acronyms. Many, if not all of those different regulatory frameworks were spun up sometime in the 1990s, some of them even into early 2000s, as we were seeing what the internet could do, right? It's just part of the evolution. And so how do we make sure we're protecting our data?
Brian, on the same topic, is this world where a company can get maybe one master assessment to rule them all? Is this a realistic possibility in the landscape we're operating in, and multi-compliance, multi-jurisdiction, et cetera? And if it's impossible, what's the best likely outcome we could strive for to reduce complexity?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's something that I've kind of been tasked with I work in government partnerships. And so I think the buzzword instead of reciprocity should be recognition. Because even if you look at the European Union landscape, there are your EU requirements for companies and cloud providers, software providers, et cetera, to meet. But then different countries within the EU have their requirements as well. So the ideal would be we get to a point where there's some recognition of the work that's being done to address risks. Okay. We see that you're doing this to address this risk or address this particular threat or this known exploitable vulnerability, and give, vendors credit for, if you will, for having that in place. It may not meet the letter of the law for every particular jurisdiction around, but it's at least acknowledging and recognizing that there is actions being taken place to address risks. It may not be documented in the same way across jurisdictions, but that risk mitigation, that practice is in place. And I think the best that we can hope for is not reciprocity or having one master compliance or cybersecurity program to meet that would address multi-jurisdictional things. I could see things happening regionally, for instance, as the EU has started. But I think the fight that we should be going for is, in the goal that we should be reaching out is probably a better term, is working for recognition of the work that cloud providers, the industry is doing to meet cybersecurity requirements.
Brian, thinking about what the FedRAMP 20X initiative is trying to accomplish, that is recognition / acceptance of other industry framework standard certifications, what have you, as a part of the larger initiative. I'm wondering if the right answer or an improved answer is using, instead of just accepting what has been already done, but using the high watermark to push that recognition, that acceptance, right? So if you think about what HITRUST and GovRAMP are doing today with the pilot program to fast track GovRAMP through HITRUST, whose ever control was more stringent became the control that was tested. So we're satisfying both requirements in either direction.
No, that's a good point. I like that, Ryan. I think that would be incredibly helpful. I still think that there's a policy back end to this, because as you see, even in the federal government, things are siloed, right? And we want to make sure that we have an opportunity to have those stakeholders come together and recognize, to use that word again, to understand that they're basically asking for the same thing in a different form. One's asking for water, one's asking for H2O. And I believe that's where it starts, to understand that. I really like that idea of high control watermark. I'm going to coin that phrase right now. I think that is a good idea to show the rigor behind, where cloud providers or industry is putting their cybersecurity effort. And it may be that if you do a delta between two different certification or compliance regimes and there is a little more work to be done, then that may be an easier lift. Back to FedRAMP, what I've seen is I looked at the moderate KSIs, and those moderate KSIs are mapped back to the 853. I think the exercise in that mapping is incredibly valuable, because there have been other organizations such as HITRUST, such as CSA, Cloud Security Alliance, that have done mappings back to the 853 controls. And so that is basically, in my opinion, opening a path for industry, for cloud providers that have met those other certification marks to map into those KSIs indirectly.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that it's not up to the individual entity being assessed to do that homework. Like, the work needs to be done up front by the different compliance regimes, as you put it, or the standards providers. We should be working together to say, hey, we've done the homework. We've seen that the mappings are adequate. Where they weren't adequate, we used the high watermark to satisfy both sides of the equation. And it's proof for use, so to speak. Any additional thoughts on the idea of mapping across these frameworks?
I love the idea of continuing to map to that NIST 853 because we have seen so many frameworks map to that. And it is very prescriptive. So you know that you can kind of cover the bases. I think what I would say, though, is while it is really important for those of us up front to demonstrate that mapping, especially if we're mapping to FedRAMP's new KSIs, to be able to say, here's how it works. However, if we don't have the buy-in of the end user who has to accept that compliance framework, then we're only doing half of the job. And so I think that stakeholder input, the governance piece is so very critical, or we're just coming to the table, I've said it before, with great ideas, great policies, great mapping. But if the users don't believe it, it kind of doesn't matter. And we saw this really specifically. We have an ongoing CJIS aligned task force, and that's the Criminal Justice Information Services Security Policy that the FBI manages, where they've done, working with their advisory committees, a lot of work to map to 853. But it's not just hey, this control and this control. They look at how you define the controls, the prescriptive, the parameters around that too. And so if we don't get into that discussion of, yes, do you have a password, but what does it mean, right? Like how many characters is it? Some may accept 4, others say 24 characters. And we've all seen the gamut. We understand why that matters. Some of those parameters really matter. And so I think mapping is the first step, and having that common language is very critical if we want to be able to drive toward framework harmonization and operationalize it. But we have to get the buy-in of the end users.
And I'd like to go back to your comments around kind of the history, right? For the listeners out there, we spoke before this session and we had a really great conversation about how the 90s and 2000s, all these different standards or frameworks. I'm dating myself.
When I was in high school, I learned on a typewriter. I had to figure out the whiteout to backspace. We all remember that horrible. Those who remember it. But my brother, who's 6 years younger, learned on a computer. I didn't have email till the end of college. He had email at the beginning of college. There's just this line where it's really fun talking. But when we think back to the olden days, Ryan, of the 1990s, that is when we started really seeing internet emerge and really the beginnings of these cloud solutions and technologies. And it's such an exciting time. But what I was mentioning, if we try to figure out how we got here, it makes a lot of sense. And there was a lot of really good work done by people who were in those agencies in the federal government, either for IRS or in healthcare or in education and in the financial services industry, where they said, hey, we really need to make sure that these technologies we're using, that we're still protecting the data. So it would be like the 4 of us on a call saying, what should we require? Actually, much smarter people than I were in those rooms during those days when they were saying, what should we require? And so you had these frameworks built in silos. In government, we like to say those are silos of excellence, but they're still silos. And so we had really excellent thought and ideas happening in these different silos. And what's happened over the course of time is those frameworks have lived on. Yes, now we have NIST. Now we have studies. Now we've got all of more data that tells us what matters most. But like any legacy government program, what often happens is rather than saying, oh, well, we'll adopt that instead, we say, great, and we'll add that to what we already have. And so what happens is you just have these really giant frameworks that have been growing over time in their own silos. And I think what we were talking about, Ryan, is we're kind of to this critical point, right? It's not a matter of will we adopt cloud? It's how do we get ourselves ready to adopt the next big thing? How do we bring AI, right? That's a big discussion, or whatever is next in. Well, we've got to, like, at some point, everyone has to say it's time to hold our horses and actually unify and have some standardization across the board. And so I love this conversation. It's a big initiative for us at GovRAMP. And I think that we have to operationalize and have these conversations so we can drive standardization where we can. But ultimately, some of this will have to happen at the federal government.
In your history, it really resonates with me when I think about what happened in 2001 with 9/11, right? The federal government was really fragmented. The intelligence communities were absolutely siloed. These were all the lessons that were learned post 9/11, is that governments need to share information, because prior to 9/11, they were deliberately not sharing information between, say, the NSA and the FBI and the CIA. Now they have these fusion centers where there's information sharing happening, which only strengthens the intelligence that's being generated. And I feel like that's kind of the model. What we're recommending here is, let's create these quote unquote fusion centers from a compliance and framework perspective so that the whole community is stronger.
To kind of dovetail off that, if you think about cloud adoption in the federal government basically stepped on the accelerator and didn't let up, right? We saw a bunch of policy and law that basically encouraged and drove commercial cloud adoption, leading to the creation of FedRAMP. Here we are, 10 years after the Cloud First Act or something like that. Don't quote me on the date or something, but the US government has gone far away. What I've seen are other jurisdictions internationally that aren't as mature in their cloud adoption, but still setting up compliance programs or cybersecurity programs for their commercial cloud, even though they're not as far down the road in adoption as the US is. And to Leah's point, even if you think of some of the legislation associated with IT, it was behind, or it is behind, because the speed of technology is changing. I think we're kind of in the same boat in some regards with the compliance programs as well. Things are changing at a more rapid rate than we can see government necessarily keep up with. Not any fault of their own. That's just the way government works, and we all understand that.
Okay, here's a question. Here's a real brain teaser. So we talked about this idea of harmonization or recognition / acceptance between standards bodies, regulatory bodies, what have you. What are the barriers to that? What are the challenges in making that a reality?
I think one of the barriers goes back to a little bit of what I was referring to, the silos of excellence. That each of these entities that owns their own framework is really wed to it. It's hard to let go of it, right? And so there's that pride of ownership. And so we have to find a way to recognize how important that has been while we're trying to bring people together. But I do think that's a barrier, is that especially in some of the agencies we mentioned, there's just that desire to really control what the framework is. And I think that's a barrier, is how do we break down that fear of losing control to actually bring people together?
I've seen this kind of on the micro level, right? When in my experience in the federal government, where granted it's a law that authorizing officials have to accept risk and review the documentation. And the idea that was being tossed around was, well, authorizing officials just should accept what another authorizing official says. But you have to understand that those authorizing officials have the inherent responsibility of keeping their department agency head away from Congress and wants to keep their boss out of hot water. And also, obviously, protecting their data, the information that belongs to their agency and the citizens. Having that reticence to just blindly accept another authorization is a very tricky proposition. And I think Leah touched on it a little bit, but it's the human factor. It's the technology that we have available. We could probably now demonstrate, at least from a technological perspective, or that a system is secure. Okay? It's the human factor to accept that and accept what somebody else has signed off on. And as Leah mentioned, these silos of excellence have in the pride of ownership, and this is what works for healthcare, this is what works for criminal justice, et cetera, and so forth. It's that same reticence that's keeping individual authorizing officials from blindly accepting the work of another and the word of another. And so that's the paradigm shift I think we have to work on, is the human factor.
And I think we have to continue to drive toward things being evidence-based. So when you talk about, and I think that we can get there, right? But I understand the human factor, because if we're all in cybersecurity and touching it in some way, we're a pretty skeptical people. We probably like to see it ourselves to believe it too. So I absolutely understand that concern of, if I'm going to accept this risk, I want to see it to believe it. And I think we've got to be able to enable that. I think we have to be able to say, okay, and kind of look under the hoods to be able to explain how something was accepted.
I think this is what the two of you are saying. I'm just saying it differently. Is I feel like there's a level of paranoia and FUD at play that is probably the biggest challenge. And that if we can figure that out, and I do have some ideas, and Leah, this intimately based on the fast track program or pilot that we have in place between HITRUST and GovRAMP today. You all are not just taking the HITRUST certification and kind of rubber stamping it and said, okay, you're now GovRAMP authorized. What we're doing is leveraging one assessment to satisfy two due diligence processes, which saves time, money, and stress, right? So for those listening out there, the way that our pilot works today is someone will scope in the GovRAMP baselines to their HITRUST assessment. They will go through the full HITRUST assessment process, have it validated by one of our external assessors, also known as 3PAOs in the GovRAMP, FedRAMP world. And then it is submitted to our QA process. If that all passes, that report is then submitted as an input into GovRAMP's existing due diligence process, and they will do additional validation, so to speak, maybe some testing if necessary. They may request sampling of evidence to gain that level of comfort and confidence that what was said during the HITRUST assessment is actually in place, but it doesn't require that organization to pay an auditor to come in and do nearly an identical assessment.
Well, I think you nailed it. If we can get to the world of assess once, serve many, right? I do this, it's right, doesn't it? But to truly be able to do that, I think does require the discussions with the different regulatory framework holders, right? And powers that be to understand what they need to see up front. So, because Ryan, that's how we've been able to do this, is to work with, right, our participating governments to understand what they need to be able to say, here's how we can allow a provider to go in. And it's sort of a choose your own adventure. What do you need to demonstrate? And do it without having to manage 7 different compliance frameworks and reporting schemes, but to do it one time. I think there's huge value in that. I think, and that's a way that I think those of us on the outside of government can really help facilitate and operationalize the discussion.
I think it's not just about the initial authorization as well. It's all post-authorization activities. Taking time to do continuous monitoring or any post-authorization monitoring, whatever it may be, depending on whatever standard, is also very time-consuming for industry as well. And I'm sure your states having to deal with multiple sort of post-authorization, or we'll just label it as continuous monitoring. Any continuous monitoring artifacts is going to be onerous on the states as well for having to meet multiple security and compliance regimes. And that's another place where I think recognition would go far. Okay, you actively have a cybersecurity program in place. You're actively addressing your vulnerabilities. Here's the high control watermark to use Ryan's schema on that. You're addressing high vulnerabilities in X number of hours, that kind of thing. That's demonstrable. There's an evidence-based approach to providing that information to whomever, and then you're good to go instead of producing multiple different Conmon reports.
Yeah, I think there's something to the idea of, obviously in the private sector, whether an organization is answering a different questionnaire that's arguably asking the same questions and just in a different way for all of their customers, what you see is that the salesperson who's trying to close a deal answers that questionnaire and it's all yeses. Yeah, we're doing all of these things. So that presents some inherent risk in the quality of that assessment. But I think escalate this up to another level when you bring in the public sector is there's probably a national security risk to having the current state continue the way it is, where you're having to do all this work individually for each reporting requirement. Does that resonate with either of you?
It's resource intensive. Going back to the previous administration, their Office of National Cyber Director did a data call to industry, and industry reported they're spending 30 to 50% of their compliance team's time on actual doing compliancy things, getting reports, auditing, et cetera, and so forth. That's work that can be done, or those are missed opportunities for those compliance entities, those compliance teams in industry to be pushing the envelope in terms of protecting the data that's inside their boundaries. And so I think that there's in addition to the national security threat, which is from both Ryan and my background, that's a pretty big deal. But also, looking at ensuring that, again, getting the information that the government needs to make risk-based decisions in not 15 different ways, I think is something that would be very much welcome in industry.
And I think from the state and local perspective, from our government perspective, that level of efficiency is very much desired as well for them, right? In two ways. One, when they are trying to vet different compliance or are the providers they're working with meeting minimum standards, being able to have that common accountability and leverage programs like ours helps make that process more efficient. But one of the things that we often forget is that all of these requirements we've talked about flow right down to states. So state governments are also in perpetual audit. They have federal auditors coming to audit them almost all the time. It's either coming from IRS, it's coming from CMS, it's coming from FBI, all the different auditors that come into audit. And basically, to your point, Ryan, asking the same question, just maybe in a different way. And if we could even synthesize those audits to say, hey, we're probably, and I always say, when we're talking framework harmonization or that trying to standardize, we're not trying to get 100% up the way the hill. I think that's not realistic. There are going to be some deltas. But if we could get 80% of alignment, think about the time and money we would save. If we were able to say, oh, you, from a state government perspective, you've demonstrated conformance and passed your IRS audit, that's great. From CMS, we only need this now, right? Because this is the delta. And I think we could find a way to do the same thing for our industry as well. But it affects both sides of the coin in a big way.
So we've talked about kind of the current state, the challenges, the problems. Where do we go from here? Like, what's the starting point? Is it working with the federal government or even the White House to try to solve this problem? Or do we feel like it's a little more grassroots where the likes of GovRAMP and HITRUST and others just start to partner and kind of show the rest of the industry the way, so to speak, what's a suitable right answer? Or is there another option or something else in between?
I think it's a combination of all those simultaneously, Ryan. I'm incredibly impressed at GovRAMP and how they've stepped out to do things first with CGIS and now with HITRUST to kind of break down the barriers, if you will, of these multiple cybersecurity and compliance regimes. But there's also effort that needs to happen all up and down the chain, right? It's the great work that the great work that GovRAMP is doing can be used as a demonstrative to policymakers to say, look, this is how it can work, right? And so, but those conversations need to be had at various levels, and starting, I don't know who we go and talk to, but that's something that we need to start bringing to the attention of government writ large, I think.
I would just echo what Brian said. Both. I think we need to keep doing the work we're doing and trying to talk to, I think it's the ONCD, it's OMB, it's talking to and supporting Senators Lankford and Senator Peters have co-authored once again another bill for framework harmonization. We should support it. We should say, yes, please. And how can we help? So those are some of the things that I think we can be doing. And I appreciate, Brian, your kind words. We are trying to put this into action in ways that we are able to try to help the effort and make things more efficient for both providers and our government members at the same time.
And I don't think the conversation is between industry and government. It's across industry as well, because these pain points are probably likely consistent across providers. And so these industry has access to trade organizations and lobbyists and the such. And that's a means for this information to get upstairs as well.
Yeah, I can tell you that we're trying to have this conversation with legislators and policymakers as much as possible. Like, we don't need a new standard. We've got lots of standards. Let's just start working between the standards. So it's going to be a long road. I mean, anybody who's worked with the federal government knows that nothing changes really at all. So it will take a bunch of effort. But I think it's a call to action for the viewers. I mean, if this resonates with you, like, join the fight. Start talking to your legislators / policymakers. And if you have a lobbying firm, add this to the agenda to make it important for you, because the more voices that the federal government in this case, but I would say it probably extends to the state government, the more voices they hear from citizens, the stronger the argument becomes.
Yeah, and I think if we approach it in a collaborative way between public and private, that would carry more weight, I think, than just coming in and say, as industry, we want this, that, and the other. I think doing it in a collaborative way, here's how we can help with the mapping, here's how we can figure out what the high control watermark is, et cetera. I think that goes a long way.
I think that's right. And I also think that the why behind this is really important. Just to bring it back, Ryan, to something you were saying, the why behind this effort is so important, because it's about allowing our industry and our leaders in government to be able to spend more time on actual security as opposed to compliance and all of the activities and it's not to say compliance isn't important. It is. We need to make sure that everyone's doing the things that they need to be doing to protect our citizens, to protect our data, to protect our critical infrastructure. Right now, though, we are not doing it in the most efficient ways. And I think everyone knows that. So if we can streamline this process, if we can have better framework harmonization and regulatory harmonization, we do know that people will be freed up then to do what only they can do in protecting their systems and in protecting their data. And I think that is really important.
Yeah, I agree. All right, I think we're coming to a close here. Want to ask one last question to the two of you. For those listening, whether they're in the public sector or private sector, what are some takeaways or call to action beyond what I've already stated? What can they be doing if this is something they feel is really needed?
I think the first step is just getting an understanding of what the regulatory environment is like. Exactly the depth and breadth of what the requirements are. I could walk into our compliance team and they can tell me, we have it on our publicly facing website. But, just seeing the number of compliance programs or certifications that a company meets is only the tip of the iceberg. That's not indicative of the work under the waterline that has to happen to achieve and maintain those. And so I think just having a deep understanding of what the regulatory environment entails, whether you're working internationally or just domestically, I think is a critical first step.
And just really quick on that, Leah, before you jump in, Brian, do you see that education or that familiarity to help strengthen their argument or justification for this acceptance and harmonization? Because if you're not speaking the same language, trying to convince somebody who has that pride of ownership that we talked about earlier would make the conversation that much more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's connecting the dots between multiple and maybe if I have to break out the crayons in the paper to draw pictures on how these two how two separate compliance regimes or certifications are related, but not. You know what I mean? And you can really only do that through a place of knowledge and a place of understanding. And so I would encourage folks to dig in.
Leah, Brian, thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. So we covered a lot of ground there, Ryan, in that exciting interview. What were some of your takeaways?
Yeah, I thought Brian and Leah's insights were really impactful, at least kind of validating my suspicions around how to operate within a multi-regulatory, multi-compliance environment. And the idea that, this is just as much of a human problem and a cultural problem as it is a technical and, a controls type of problem. So the solution has to be multi-pronged or multifaceted, or we're not going to, make a lot of progress. That to me was the biggest takeaway, is just understanding where do we go from here.
Well said. And for those companies who are navigating this problem space, of which there are many, and you're a current HITRUST customer, we'd love to hear from you about how you're navigating this and what works, what doesn't work. We're all ears to identify other areas to help you coordinate directly with other standard setting bodies and regulators, etc., to help identify those other areas of, what did Brian say? Recognition and or reciprocity, but recognition to maybe help you have one less assessment to do so you could focus on that big why that Leah mentioned, which is not more compliance, it's better security. So do reach out, hit us on LinkedIn. And while you're there, please leave a good note about our podcast. Give us a good review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends about Trust Versus. So thanks again for another episode, for being a listener. Talk to you soon.